corporate world, Citibank, sharing plow pharmaceuticals. About that time, the internet was taking off, and joined in that boom, and got involved in consulting, and then into consulting. So I've kind of been in the something related to the customer-ish space throughout my career. And you kind of see, one way to tell the story is some of the basic lessons that I've learned. So, this outside-in perspective, this is the time when New York City was going through rapid and evolving change. And as it was coming out of bankruptcy, a lot of crime, like the old New York City movies, graffiti, crime everywhere, gangs, all that sort of crack cocaine, murders everywhere. The city wanted to reimagine itself. And so it had this citizen, we didn't call it that at the time, but it was basically a citizen-centric perspective. And we started to think about how to reimagine some of these city services and what we were doing in New York City at the time. And my role was looking at the workforce and thinking about what does it take for that workforce. The idea was basically this outside-in perspective that we now talk about. When into the 90s, we got into market. I got into market modeling and customer profiling. So this is really just pretty much straight. Why are our customers here? How can we get more customers? A little bit, I would say, predates what we would now call, or maybe it's in the time of database marketing. It wasn't quite personalized and all the things we talk about now, because all that didn't, this is pre-digital in that sense. I think where things really take off is in around the late 90s, mid to late 90s, is when CRM kind of jumped in. CRM, customer centricity. I'll talk about that as we get through some of the lessons of the mythology of CX today as we get going. In the 2000s, transition from CRM, CX as a standalone business discipline, and kind of help develop that field. And then as we move on into where we are now, and really recognizing the need for cultural transformation, not just CX capability and so forth. So really what this session is about is, along that path of 25 years, I've picked up some things, and some things that I guess in one way I frame it as there's overt CX, the stuff we generally talk about, that we talk about to other places, that we generally talk about when we get certified, we generally talk about it everywhere. It's what you generally read about. And then there's what I would call covert CX. This is a little bit under the table. I think many of us know some of these things. You may not agree with everything, but this is a little bit covert. So this is really about the covert. And frankly, this presentation is an updated version. I've only given this one other time, and that's about 4 or 5 years ago. And quite a few things have been added to this presentation. At the time, what I was thinking is, if you think about guys doing a battle, and effectively, in CX, we're kind of in a battle. There's a regular way of doing business and this new way of doing business, and we're kind of in this battle. And you think about guys being prepared for war, for battle. And they kind of learn, perfect ways to shoot. You can get in the perfect position to do this, and here's a maneuver that you can do out on the battlefield, X's and O's, and you can rehearse and practice all that stuff back home. But the real battle is in the trenches. And, like almost any war movie, there's the battle-hardened sergeant who's been out there for the longest time, and these guys were coming from the camps. They get it. They have the basics. They certainly know how to shoot. They certainly know how to have formations and march in lines and so forth. But when the bullets start flying, they need that battle-hardened person who's learned the real scars of what it takes to not only survive, but to win the battle. And in essence, what this session is about is, I guess, what I have picked up in ICOR, maybe what I've learned through my battle scars. And in the battle, there are these gremlins that are all over the place. And in fact, the mythology, the myths that I'm picking up, I'm guessing I'm calling these gremlins that are part of battle, things that don't happen according to the textbook way. So if we are aware of these things, then we can kind of think about it. And that's in a sense what this battle-hardened sergeant, who's kind of helping the guys understand what the realities of the situation is, not just theoretically how we do things, but the reality, and when it's imperfect, in an imperfect world, when bullets are flying, what does it look like? So that's kind of like the pretext of what I'm going to talk about. Frankly, I'm hoping to push some of your buttons in this presentation. For those of you who are new to it, I'm a total fan of CX. I feel that I've helped develop the field along with some of my colleagues, and I'm a total fan. But I'm also a realist, and I think that sometimes the realism of what we face we don't talk about that enough. We kind of talk about these programs, we kind of hear the successes of the program, but sometimes we kind of want to hear the war stories that go along with it. So this is, I guess, a very high level view of not necessarily the war story, but you'll at least kind of hear the battle scars. Okay, so that's my basic pretext. What about why myths? Why did I call this the myths of CX? Well, I kind of put them as the myth is a widely held but false belief or idea. Maybe that's a bit strong for what I'm talking about today, but again, I really frame this as covert CX, the things that are a little bit under the table, rules of thumb, heuristics, whatever you want to call those things that are maybe not spoken, or maybe you have an inkling of, or maybe you've run across, you may feel them stronger than I do, you may feel them less than I do, you may not feel them at all if you're an experienced person, but that's where this presentation comes from. So let's start off. I have about 7 of these to talk about, and hopefully there'll be enough room to kind of get your points of view on each, or a little bit on each. The first myth is the myth of CX ascension. So CX is on the way, it's a burgeoning field. We, as practitioners, whether you're new to the field and you're looking to grow, and everything is kind of on this progression, everything is going high in this progression. But many of you also know there's a lot of us that are jaded. And if you read some articles about, is this a field, can you base your career off of this field? Is this something we need to be worried about? Where do we fit in a world where in a resource constrained world, and where we are the new kids on the block in a sense? This is the myth of CX ascension. Don't assume that it's just this upward trajectory in every kind of, of course with hills, loops, and all that, but this upward trajectory. And maybe one of the ways that I try to think about this, and kind of looking out at what other people have written, and of course HBR is a good place to go for a lot of things, for thoughts. Common reasons that experienced programs fail, and these things I think we now know. This is about from 2016, and I think has not changed so much. They're not designed with change or innovation in mind. Keep this innovation in mind for something a little bit later. They have soft metrics rather than real business goals, the hard business stuff of business. And they move slowly and without purpose. So just keep that in mind. So this is why our programs, initiatives fail. So not enough innovation. What's really different about them? Too soft, and maybe they move too slow, or at least they appear to move too slow. If you take that a bit further, they say, well, okay, if that's why it fails, what's required is some ownership of the program, some expertise. Okay, got that. We'll get better at that. It needs some resources, and they suggest something commensurate with those of an IT program. And it needs some empowerment, basically some level of authority. Now, I put red flags on these just to say, think about your own situations, or just look out at the world, and you already know that ownership is already a challenge. I think we've had some speakers that spoke to this, and just Google it and you'll see this comes up. We're starting, of course, to talk about chief customer officer, chief experience officer. But even if it's not that, even if it's not, the heady title, even if it's, just the head of CX or whatever, program lead, whatever you want to call it, the ownership of, And in CX, as you know, there's been a large dispute because of discussion. Who owns the customer? Nobody owns the customer. Who owns the program? Okay, that's another thing. But this ownership of the experience and the customer experience is kind of an interesting concept that I don't think is not fully answered. Because even when you have a chief customer or chief experience officer, as I think someone mentioned earlier today, do you own customer experience of the company? And generally we say no. We know that because the whole company needs to be able to deliver on that. So what is that we're owning? So anyway, this is just a contentious point of view is all I'm pointing out here. Resources, and again, we're always short on resource, but here they say start with a basic budget commensurate with those of an IT program. And when I looked at that, and I kind of think most of us probably would be pretty happy if we actually had, whether it's even if we're not starting out, if we had a budget that was commensurate with those of IT programs, because those sound to us generally like pretty large programs. And I find, if we can get that, that's fantastic. So red flag, because I think it's if we can get that, that's fantastic. And then empowerment. Just like the ownership question, empowerment is an interesting word, but I think of empowerment as being the ability to step on toes. So what does that mean? If you're in CX program, do you have the actual ability to step on the toes of people in marketing, in operations, in engineering, in health and safety, and whatever other bits of the business? Can you step on toes of the retail organization? And we have some ways of doing that, but when we do step on the toes, is it a light step? I mean, you can go at this analogy, take it too far, but do they have steel-toed shoes so that even if we're doing that, they don't feel it? That's really the point. This authority, again, is a contentious point of view. So I'm questioning ownership, resources, and empowerment in the real world of CX leadership. And it's again to look at your own or our own positions to say, what does that actually mean for us? And we can get to what it should mean, but for me, ownership, I'm linking it to the authority. Do I have the ability? Do I have some carrot? And do I have some whip? Can I use these things? Am I expected to use these things? And then budget, of course, is it anything like commensurate with those of an IT program? Questions that are out there. Now, this gets to the heart of the matter for me. When I think about what it looks like in reality, and you can, of course, feel free to challenge me, but I have these two dimensions here. Why you took the role, and we all need a job, but basically, if you think about many people who come to CX-like role, they were in something else in the business, something happens, the business gets some vision or whatever, we need some people in CX, and they move into this role. Some people are really, really enthusiastic about it, and other people are moved into some kind of role. It could start off as support and it becomes full-time. So it's more of the job, and we'll get into it as we go along. So that's the first column there. On the second column, it's kind of like the real believers. And I'm imagining a lot of people on the call here are real believers. We really, really believe in it. That, by the way, just because you're on this call or people on this call doesn't mean you are in this match. I'm being very honest and true here. Are there people who could be satisfied with the role, knowing that we're not going to go too far ahead with the actual impact? So again, that's that side. That's why I took the role. Then it's why did the company establish the role? Whatever the role is, CXO, CCO, head of lead, CX practitioner, whatever it is. And then on that, it is, again, the company can have true vision. And by company, we can argue what that actually means. Is it someone at the company who's powerful, or is it the company? Do they really want to transform towards CX? Or do they kind of talk about it, but that uphill battle is super steep? Every company has trouble transforming, so we're always going to have some kind of angle to it, some steepness to it. But I'm talking about at the top, we're kind of at a slope, something like this. And at the bottom here, when you're just talking about it, that slope is like this. So it's really, 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 really difficult. And again, that honest opinion. Now, if you look inside the boxes, I kind of give some descriptors of roughly what these mean. If you're really looking to make an impact and the company really wants to do it, that's a perfect place to be. That's the ideal. That's what everyone, we hope we're in that role. I argue that that's might be where we start off when we take jobs oftentimes. If you're really a true believer, you've been through the recruiting process, you kind of looked at things, it sounds good, they've sold you on it, you joined, you did all these things. You get there and then you find there's a movement. Maybe the movement is that you find that the company is not that serious for what really is required to make an impact. The company is not that serious. And so you might move in this movement where you kind of go down a notch. And then it's like, this is a common place to be. Like, they're not as serious as I want them to be. This is the fight of transformation. And so you're kind of pushing the company to really understand what it means to transform. They thought it meant something, but they're really not talking about your angle. Now, if you fight and fight and fight and fight and fight and fight and you're not kind of getting anywhere, maybe you don't get the budget, maybe you don't get the authority, maybe you don't really have the ownership, maybe you don't have the ability to step on toes. This little brown dotted line is a trajectory that many CX people go. And by the way, I started this company. I'm kind of on this trajectory, give it a year, 2 years. I need to find another job. That's roughly what that trajectory means. My point here is not to say that this is where CX is or should be. I'm just saying when you are, and I think I heard someone say earlier, if you have this honest assessment, and by the way, you should have an honest assessment of any role that you're about to take to understand how steep this slope is, so you can judge how much authority, how much budget, how much whatever you might need or less, or how happy you can be in this particular role. Or maybe that's if you want impact, or maybe I understand it's this steep, I just want this job, it's a good title and good pay, this is where I am, and I'm happy with some situation in this. So it's just about being honest. I think that's what this is getting at. It's not suggesting this is the trajectory, because of course it can be the opposite way. You get there, you inform, you teach, you influence, you do all the things that many CX people are actually having to do right now. They're influencing because the company thinks they're ready to transform, but then they find out what it really takes, and there's a whole bunch of work that goes on, and then you push up and you move the company up there. So that's the situation. And I'm just saying, don't assume that there's always this forward progression. The reality, the covert, the hidden battle scar bit of it is you may find yourself in a role, and many of us, whether this, by the way, this could just not just be a role, this could also be consulting. A lot of my experience actually is working on major projects at companies where you kind of have to know right up front, I'm taking this project. I believe the chances they will actually do major CX is not that great. So either we tone it down, even though they want major CX, they're paying for this big budget thing, but they're not quite ready for that. So you have to then gauge where you are. So that's all, just a kind of a reality check is what this is. Now, as we know, only 25% are winning with CX initiatives. So only 25% of these initiatives are there. So that means 75% are not really producing a lot of value. And it's generally not because of the expertise, because what we talked about earlier, not enough budget, not enough resource, not enough authority. When it's time to step on toes, either not enough weight or no ability to actually step on those toes, and no real ownership of things. And the influencing that you're supposed to do is kind of at the behest of whoever you're supposed to influence. So you get the appointment, you can walk into the office as long as they allow you into the office. So again, that's getting to that authority thing. Basically, 75% are not really producing, a lot of spinning of wheels. Downward trajectory is kind of what I'm talking about there. Now, one way to think about this is we are the newest kid on the block in terms of business disciplines. You can't hardly find a business discipline that's newer than us. And if you put us, and you think about silos, I just listed a few here: accounting, marketing, IT, and I include CRM as and you'll see why in one of the later myths. But accounting and marketing have centuries head start on us, so they've been around this track many times. They understand, they're mature, they have all kinds of things, hard metrics. They understand how to measure their performance, understand how to measure the business performance. They can look at others. They have a complete full lens. Everyone accepts it. People go to business school to get trained on their disciplines. It's hard, you can't really move up without at least some basic understanding of some of those concepts. IT, making fast strides, technically not really possible going back, but we got to the point and now really advancing on itself and has a huge head start on us. CRM is closer to us, and this is a particular one. I put this here for a particular reason. It's a 5-year head start, but in a sense have merged with IT. So they're kind of piggybacking off of the maturity of IT and kind of moving forward. So we're literally pretty much, if you think about, centuries old disciplines in business, we're like at the starting gate. So for us to compete, when I'm talking about compete, I'm talking about the gravity of our discipline compared to the others. It's super weak gravity. We're trying to make it a deeper gravity because it's super important, of course, but that's really the context. And we don't tend to think of it like this. We tend, as real believers, we tend to think of it as how important it is for business. But in a siloed business mentality, worldview, point of view, we're at the starting gate. They've been running, done several marathons ahead of us. And so we're learning how to walk, to run, to stand up, to get our lungs in shape. That's really a good context for a lot of things that's coming later. So what does this mean? Be brutally honest, as I said, about your position or your company's position and trajectory. It allows you to, number one, not get too frustrated, because frustration is an enemy of a CX practitioner. You expect too much and have, super high hopes, and they're just hopes. And you start work and you're working and you're working and you're working, and the business is saying, where's this grand stuff that we expect out of CX? You can kind of lose your enthusiasm and you lose your will to live, in a sense, through that. So just be brutally honest, not only about yourself, but also about your company. So you hear about maturity assessments and so forth. If you get a maturity assessment, make sure, that's of your business, make sure it will be an honest assessment. And again, there may be an overt and a covert one. There may be here's the 5, pillars, principles that we're going to look at. But make sure that, and we'll talk a bit about this, the consultant who does this maturity, make sure that you want them to tell you, even if they don't tell anyone else, the honest sticking points, what's going to go wrong, what is not likely to change, what can change, how much authority is there, because that's something that you will need to help kind of keep your balance and things moving forward. Okay, so that's the first myth. You okay with this one? I don't know if people can speak or anything. Any comments here? Looks like it's gonna be okay. All right, I will move on. Second one, the myth that CX declaration equals actual agreement. So I'm starting off pretty simple here, and I think we all know this. This is the idea that, whoever, the company, a person of position, says, totally support CX. And this is where a term that I call bobblehead CX comes in. And the idea of this bobblehead CX is that in most companies now, most large companies for sure, the words CX are there. So remember in the first myth, we talked about this idea of we're saying we're CX oriented, we want to be, versus we're committed to this transformation. In most large organizations, those words are there. It's rare to find an organization that would just literally say nothing about CX. And there's different levels of maturity, but basically that's there. And I think most senior executives would also say, yep, like the idea of the CX thing. But a large proportion of that agreement is just bobblehead. And bobblehead are like you see here, these little dolls that are just kind of doing this head nod thing that's going on. And this head nod thing is it's a visual show. It looks like agreement. It can even sound like agreement, but there's absolutely no commitment behind that. So the moment they stop talking to you, the CX person, or happen to be in whatever CX sounding meeting, that bobblehead, yes, stops, and they get back to what they consider to be the real work of business. So this, and sometimes that bobblehead can confuse us, and that's what creates some of the frustration in the first myth, because it looks like people are all agreeing. You know, when you took the job, everyone was giving you the spiel about how great CX is and how much they want to. And when you talk to them one-on-one, it's fantastic, but you don't see anything on the back end of that. That's bobblehead CX. And basically now, I assume, I don't care who it is, where and when, and when I'm talking about consulting, right? When I talk to people, I assume that what they're giving me is bobblehead CX. I don't assume it's agreement. I change to agreement once I start to see something on the back end of that bobblehead. And I think it's a very healthy position. It's prevented me from getting into a lot of situations where I get, again, I call it frustration. I don't get that frustrated when people don't follow up, when people don't do this. I assume that's the natural way for most people. Not that they're purposely doing it, I just assume it's bobblehead. And it's a very useful concept for me. And I think it takes off, and I've used this now for quite a while, and a lot of organizations, talking to a lot of senior people, and the term takes off. They didn't necessarily apply it to themselves, but it's an easy way to talk about just bobbleheading a thing. By the way, this could be CX, it could be anything, but the bobblehead concept is there. The other one is this 90-10 rule. So Edward Deming, you know, the statistical genius who kind of helped Japan come out of its World War II and with this sort of statistical ways of management, TQM and all of that stuff. He kind of had this rule with the idea of performance and quality management. And actually it applies in CX as well. Except here's my take on it, that 90%, roughly 90% of the problems that customers complain about are caused not by the people who they directly interact with, but by people back behind the scenes. So headquarter type people. You know, I would say the people who earn the biggest paychecks, who wear the smartest suits, who have the biggest, create the policies, the procedures, the practices, they design all that stuff back at headquarters. And these customer facing types try to put that into action with the customers. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to the customers or it doesn't work, and the customers complain. They complain, of course, about what they see, which is the customer facing people. I didn't like this, the website, I didn't like this, I didn't like that, I didn't like your sales staff or your sales staff or whatever. So they're complaining about that front end bit that they're seeing, which is of course what they should do. But what it does is give the people who created all those problems, the 90%ers, a get out of jail card, because NPS doesn't say anything about the legal department generally. NPS doesn't say anything about procurement. NPS doesn't say anything about treasury. NPS doesn't say anything about, you know, health and safety or regulatory or whatever risk management you have back behind the scenes, who, and you know, you break up all those departments, but basically they have this get out of jail card when it comes to customer, which allows them even more so to do the bobblehead, because they can hear problems that the customer is complaining about, and they're thinking we totally should be fixing that. And in fact, you know, frontline guys, call center, contact center, retail, fix it. You know, these guys are, our customers are important. Fix it. And this is really a kind of a circle that feeds on it upon itself. So declaration does not equal actual agreement. Don't confuse, I would call it CX romance for CX commitment. And that's the battle scar is simply when you get the head nod, whatever that looks like. You know, there's different ways of that head, but I think you understand where I'm coming from. Don't assume that that's commitment. Assume that that's just romance. And that's really the lesson from myth number 2. Okay. I'm gonna, any comments here? I'll just pause after each one just to see if there's any comments, and feel free, even if you disagree. Like I don't see it. I mean, do you see this, or is this totally alien, or is it okay? Okay. All right. Myth number 3. The myth of the power of the top-down mandate. So quite often in CX, we hear how important it is to have, you know, executive sponsorship. Most often, CEO should be a part of this, and the CEO should this if we do that. Of course, that's true. So I'm not disputing that. Part of that is, again, the reality that most of us find ourselves, or many of us find ourselves, is that we don't really have that access. And if you're in consulting, and especially if you're in a more of the boutique consultancies, oftentimes in a very large company, you don't have access to that either. You might get a meeting or 2, but you don't have access to that either. But part of the, and I would say this is really a consulting thing. It makes sense, by the way, but it's also part of a consulting thing. Consultants always want to go up some levels because the budgets get bigger. So part of this is weaved into what's required for things to happen at a CX level. Now, in a perfect world, of course, the CEO is responsible for everything. If you can get to, if you have the ear of the CEO and the pocketbook of the CEO, you can make big things happen. And if you're one of the larger consultancies that you all know by name, they have a much greater chance, which allows them to run these gigantic programs. But can an organization, can you go for this impact, part of the transformation, without necessarily guaranteeing you have that? Because again, if that was absolutely necessary and critical, you could say most CX could stop right now, because a lot of it doesn't happen. We don't actually have that real commitment from the top. One way I think of this is like this, as you go through a transformation. So remember, we want to go for this impact. The company really wants to transform. Okay, that's that top box in the myth number 1 we talked about. May not be perfect, but you can think about it as a pre-CX time where the business operates on whatever the status quo of that business is. And presumably it's pre-CX, so it's not CX is what they're working on. It's something else that's happening there. And then whatever happens, the new senior management, new CEO, the bug happens, person becomes a visionary suddenly and gets this, we got to do something with our CX. Or possibly it's some crisis that happens, which is quite common. And at that point, the business is not operating on CX. But you do have a powerful person who says, we got to get on the ball with CX. That is the common version of a top-down mandate to the business. And as that gets going, sometimes, as I said earlier, some people are moved from certain departments. That could be from risk, that could be from compliance, that could be from health and safety, that could be from marketing, that could be from customer insights, that could be from wherever else into a CX kind of role, or they start something new, a new function, a new program, a new role, a CX role to kind of help with this. And typically what happens at that stage as they build some capabilities, of course, but they start to rely on compliance. We now have, guys, we didn't really do much with customer before. We had CSAT, we did that once a year. Now we're going to have NPS, and we have a system in place, and here's the new rule. Here is the thing that must happen. We looked at our contact center, and now everyone must answer the phone within 3 rings, and you must have, our new greeting is X, Y, and Z. So you have a lot of compliance, a lot of rules about what should happen. No one, or few people believe yet, but they get in trouble. In other words, some kind of stick from somewhere if they don't follow these rules. What happens if you don't move to the phase 2, as I've listed here, is those rules, of course, are weights on people's shoulders. And frankly, the real reality is, if you don't do much on the cultural piece, people begin to resist and resent CX. It has almost the opposite effect of what it's supposed to have. It forces people to pretend, and they will learn workarounds. They will learn how to effectively bobblehead. They will learn how to do. This doesn't happen right away, but it does happen over time, where if you simply rely on compliance, so you have some beautiful policies, some beautiful rules, some beautiful process at headquarters. Everyone is kind of like trying to follow that because they don't want to get hit over the head in the quarterly review meeting or whatever it is. And they begin to resent this thing called CX. And that's the worst case to be in, because you have the exact opposite effect of what you were trying to get to. And it literally destroys everything. I've seen many organizations who've started off like that and have left it too long with the coming up with new stuff and just relying on compliance. What you need to do, of course, that you probably will, you have to go through this bit because no one believes in it yet. So you got to go through some policies and so forth. But crucial is that in order to people to not just completely resent or feel it's ridiculous and just try to find workarounds to those policies, is that you got to do some work on the culture, which gets people to actually believe. So non-believers, agnostics to CX, to transform them individually into a believer. With that, they start to understand why the policies, or and so on and so forth. And that's where, if the culture takes hold, you get the innovation and the big win from CX. So a lot of 75% of programs that are not successful, it's not because they don't do anything. It's because they've done things, they have stuff. That stuff is relying on the compliance. People are starting to resist, find other ways of working around those things because they've lost belief in what the whole program is about. And in many organizations, they just simply, as middle management can do, outlast, wait until the senior team leaves, new vision comes in, maybe CX will be gone, and we'll be done with all this crappy CX stuff. So if you don't include the cultural transformation, that's what happens there. I think there's lots of stats out there. We just talked about this in the red here. 7% of CEOs don't even have CX on the main agenda. So this is from this little bit from Forbes. And if you think about this, only 56% of CEOs are involved in CX initiatives. Okay, so if you kind of combine those two, that means 37% are not deeply involved. So we can kind of estimate that about 45% of CEOs are not deeply committed to CX. I don't think this is necessarily news. The number, we'll see this number. I've seen a lot of studies and roughly like this, deeply committed. Remember we talked about in the first myth, this idea of talking about CX versus really wanting it. And talking about it is pretty easy. So I wouldn't call that deep commitment. The deep commitment is beyond the messaging and it's beyond the head nod, the bobblehead. It's some other actions. Some of that action can be budget, but there's a caveat to the budget thing. And then the other one is the authority piece, which is for me a little bit closer to the real measure of how deeply committed CEOs, how much authority do they give to the CX team to step on toes when it's not when CX, in the appropriate way is not happening. And that takes us to this. So Forrester, kind of this little circle on the side here, kind of says, look, here's 6 areas that when you look at CX management, these are the 6 areas that, there's a few other ways of looking at it, but this is as good as any. And if you think about what a deeply committed CEO should be deeply committed or deeply involved in, I think of 2 areas. One is setting this vision for CX, and the other one is, and importantly, the prioritization. So the business is prioritizing. We can prioritize many different ways. We're going to prioritize on using CX as part of that prioritization metric. And I think the CEO needs to set that example. If the CEO isn't actively doing that, and it's just a vision, that's messaging and possibly a lot of bobbleheading and a report, the paragraph on customer experience type stuff. If with the prioritization, kind of pushing it forward, that's when decisions start to be made slightly differently. I put all that together to say this: the myth of the power of the top-down mandate. Number one, yes, the vision needs to be ratified, maybe created, whatever, top down. But the best visions, CX vision that I'm talking about, needs to feel to colleagues, peers, the workforce, like it was constructed bottom up. They will have to put it into action. I'm not talking about the front line alone. Middle management, senior middle management, whatever you want to call them, they need to feel some ownership of that vision. They can't just be told. And that for me is this myth of the mandate. They will agree. Who's going to disagree with the CEO? They will agree, or as we now know, they will bobblehead, wait, but that doesn't mean they actually bought into it or will actually try to make that vision manifest. And of course, as is commonly said, and we know, culture cannot be mandated. It's the most difficult thing to establish. The great thing, this is the jump from relying on compliance to relying on belief in the maturity thing that I showed earlier. If you know that you can get this, that jump is super difficult, by the way, super difficult. But the beauty of it is, if from a CX perspective, you can start to move the organization or bits of the organization or parts of the organization into that cultural piece where people are actually believing in CX, then that also is difficult to extinguish. So even if the CEO changes, even if the board changes, if you've been able to establish some culture, that stays. If all you've done is build capability, the new CEO comes in and cuts the budget or changes or whatever, all that goes, CX ends like in an instant. The only thing that can persist all these changes and very difficult to extinguish is a culture. So ultimate aim should always, and no matter what you're doing, is how can I get some cultural, how can I create some believers? We think about promoters, but in a CX program, how can I create some believers in CX? And again, being very honest, are they a believer or are they just bobbleheading? Okay, number 4, the myth of the power of numbers. The myth of the power of numbers. So here I'm kind of thinking about metrics, business case, ROI. So lots of research out there. ROI is the biggest obstacle to my program success. Common stuff. Some work done by Pointillist kind of points out that 2019, 2020, quantifying customer experience ROI, finding the ROI is like the major thing that we need to try to do. Many organizations are asking for this ROI. What's the ROI, this program of CX? Why should we invest in CX? If you look at the customer view, the pie chart here, you can see about 43% of executive leadership believe that at best there is a small ROI of CX. Recall that we said, you know, roughly 45% of CEOs are not deeply committed to CX. And here we're seeing that 43% of executive leaders believe that at best there's a small ROI of CX. Now, what does that mean? We have believers who believe CX, regardless of anything, CX delivers something. Like they have a belief. They have a belief. They have a belief that CX delivers something. And you have this 43% who are like, I don't really believe, you know, I don't really, at best, maybe it's a little something, you know, it's a good something to talk about, but I don't really believe that it delivers something. Now there's a couple of strategies to deal with this. One could be, I believe if I show these non-believers the numbers, then that's all they're asking for. Just show me the number and you win me over. That's one belief. Another belief or another approach. Another approach is, even if you show them the numbers, they still don't believe. Think about what I said about the track, right? The numbers that we generally have to show are relatively weak compared to what finance, accounting, whatever some of the other disciplines have. Generally speaking, our numbers are weaker or not as accepted as some of the numbers that they have. And I mean in a broad sense. So even if you show the numbers, a case, they don't necessarily believe it. It's pretty easy to poke holes. Well, there's that, and the other. And in fact, I know many CX people who take jobs and then spend hours, what I would call in busy work, creating this case. They they collect all the numbers, they do all this work, they do all this thing, they build the case, they get it, they present it to someone, and what happens at that meeting, after spending months of building this case in a model and a whatever else that you want to call it, people start poking holes in it. Like, yeah, I don't, this assumption, that's an assumption, this, that, and the other. We don't have this data, that sort of thing. So this is a problem, this 43%. Now, of course, generally, we have evidence, and we use this all the time, right? People who grade in CX have this benefit. People who, the leaders, they outperform this, and they outperform the S&P 500. They have better revenues, their costs are lower, other kinds of things. But if you look honestly at a lot of this kind of evidence, and it's good evidence, I use it. I still use it because it's the best that we have pretty much at the moment. It's a lot of correlation type evidence. We're trying to get into driver analysis and what literally leads to this. Even a lot of the driver analysis sometimes can be almost correlational in the way that some of it's done. Of course, with technology, data analytics, we're getting much better at some of it, but for some, because CX is people, person, kind of a thing, and we're talking about psychology of people, and attitude makes an importance, and how people perceive things is important in CX. That behavioral bit, we can kind of get very much closer to the driver analysis, causal analysis of, this happened in that behavior, because it's a very hard number. They bought something, they didn't buy something. They visited or they didn't visit. They spent 10 minutes or they spent 5 minutes in the shop, whatever. Those are very hard behavioral kind of outcome metrics, and we have some operational metrics and things that we can kind of connect, and we can see if there's something there. When it becomes perceptual metrics, rate how you think the experience was, would you recommend, blah, 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 it fluctuates quite a bit. And as I think many people know, the ROI to those attitudinal things starts to look foggy. And to finance people, the attitudinal bit to revenue is a little bit foggy. So it starts to get there. So in other words, our metrics are weaker than some other businesses. Now, that's changing over time. And this is not a presentation on the future of CX, but where we are going. And by the way, technology helps, but there's also a flag on that, which we'll get to in a moment, is nanotechnology, neuroscience, and all of that, which we will literally have, I believe, a new field, which will be called customer accounting or something like that, where debits and credits will literally be neural responses. We're ways away from that, but we're headed in that direction. So not neuromarketing, but new neuro accounting, or whatever you want to call that. Right now, with our perceptual metrics, it's relatively weak from this point of view. So helpful hints, if we need to make cases though. I fully appreciate that. The best way I've seen to make a case, and this is general rules of thumb here, target specific behaviors. I said, if you have a retail shop and you want to increase the time people spend in the shop, or you want to decrease the number of calls, nonsense calls people call into the call center, or these kinds of things, you have a very hard behavioral thing that you're looking at. And then you can look at some things that you might play with on the CX side to see if it affects that behavior. Of course, you need a baseline to understand what the change is. Involve finance early to understand, so that they understand not just the outcome, but what you're doing, and it's specifically that they kind of get the model, but you can kind of build them into the middle bit, which is, we're going to do some CX stuff here, and we're going to hopefully change this outcome, which is this behavior, how much time they spend in the store, how much money they spent in the store, whether they visited 1 page on the website, 2 pages, 3 pages, whatever it is. Shoot for scalable returns rather than the promised target. So rather than saying, I'm going to go for a 10% increase, say that we're going to make this change, and hopefully we'll see what the change is on this side. So if we make a 1-point change here, we hopefully will see what that looks like on this side. That allows you greater flexibility. Get tacit agreement up front that improvements are due to CX. I'm basically saying here, we're influencers. We don't have a lot of sway in most organizations, or compared to some other of the silos. If it works, the CX intervention works, the outcome came out. What happens oftentimes is other departments, functions, initiatives, work streams claim credit. We were involved, that's ours. they have a longer history, they have deeper roots, connections, and so they get the credit. However, we make the intervention and it drops, we get the blame. So get everyone to understand and some kind of agreement that if we make, these are the changes, and if we see something that proves, we all agreeing that that's going to be us, right? Second to last, as much as possible, use operational data. I kind of mentioned this operational behavioral data versus survey data. And that's, again, pointing that outcome variable and figuring out some stuff in the business that you can look at and impact. And then reporting the case, make sure that the CX intervention is the central story. So we now have the results. We like the results. Tell the story from what the CX intervention is. And we did this intervention, make that jazzy, blah, 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 blah. And here's the outcome. What some people do is they tell the story from a dry, formulaic point of view, blah, 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 3 variables, da, 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 this, that, and the other, charts and graphs. It's super dry. It looks like everything else, and we lose the CX. And in fact, people tend to see that like operational changes, not CX changes. So for the power of numbers, storytelling may be more important than proving. Storytelling, so you hear this in almost every CX conference, the ability to storytell is super important. So even if you are a very metric-oriented person and a team that's really going after it, make sure you have a storyteller. That skill on your team is worth its weight in gold. Quantitative customer research justifies, but qualitative research inspires. And oftentimes we forget that where we are in the business, if you again think about myth number 1, is we need to inspire people to even pay attention to whether they need to justify. So when I mentioned about sometimes these people on the busy work of creating the case, they do all this work, they're pulling numbers together, they get to the end and they present this dry looking business case that doesn't inspire anyone, it goes nowhere. So they spend all that time, which, you know, maybe it was good for a job, but it really didn't do anything. It doesn't inspire anyone. Never forget to inspire when you're doing this. And typically qualitative research will give you a better play than quantitative for the inspiration bit, worth its weight in gold. And the metric is less important than the story behind the metric. I'm just restating, but it's not NPS is 70, CSAT is 68, customer effort is 2, whatever it is. It's what does that mean is the important. And again, that ties back into the storytelling. So storytelling is very important. The myth that I'm talking about, the power of numbers, is just because you have a number doesn't really do anything. That's the myth. It looks like it. People have asked you for it. The business said your primary aim is to come up with this case, do this, do that. But really, without inspiration, without the storytelling, it can almost just be busy work. And other function departments can claim credit for the beautiful work that may have come out of it. Number 5, the myth of the power of CX artifacts. So we produce stuff. We're in that second phase. Remember, relying on status quo, relying on compliance, finally, cultural change, getting people to believe in CX. And that middle phase where you've invested in some kind of measurement system, you've invested in developing personas, you've invested in creating these beautiful journey maps, you've invested in whatever else that's out there, some design thinking and some whatever else. You've done those things. What can happen is you've invested in those things, you've hired consultants to create beautiful journey maps, you've hired some expensive NPS or whatever other metric system that you have out there, you've hired some beautiful designers to help you come up with new innovative things that are possible ideas. You've created these beautiful personas, but as I think many of us know, those personas can sit on the shelf or possibly a poster on the wall. The design thinking is a great concept, double diamond, heard of it, but don't have time to use it. NPS is a fantastic, expensive system, and typically, you got to get to the whip bit of this NPS system, and everyone's like looking at this number, but no one cares about the story behind NPS, the previous myth. And effectively, in that compliance phase I talked about, if that goes on too long with no belief, what happens? The NPS system starts to feel like this weight. And so now I'm trying to work around and finagle my way and do other things, because the only thing I want to have happen is when I go to that quarterly meeting or whatever it is, the review meeting, I just don't want my NPS to be negative. I don't care what it is. I just don't want to be hit over the head with it. And same thing with journey maps. The beautiful maps, but not gonna do anything. I could put vision here, CX vision, whatever else. If we don't use it, it's cost to the business. And here, I'm just saying mindset trumps artifact. Decorative CX is when the artifact trumps mindset. We're compliant, we have the stuff, the business can point to, we're investing, we're so much into CX, but no one is really using it. So co-creation or the design process is more often important or more important than the output itself. The co-creation process, the creation process is more important. I generally say it like the second bullet. Journey mapping, the act of journey mapping is more important than the journey map that is produced. Why? Because the various departments, groups, people, individuals that are involved, whether customers are involved, however you do your method of journey mapping or design thinking, throw in there, just say, let's keep it a journey mapping. That process is starting to create a new kind of language, a new way of thinking about things in the business. And so this is what I mean. Journey mapping is more important than the journey map. Most businesses I see put so much emphasis on having the journey map. I do just the opposite. I place the emphasis on the journey mapping. I think the journey map is almost useless, and I believe it will be decorative if the business has not understood how we do journey, not how we do it as in the method, but if they're not participating in journey mapping. If that becomes something that we're doing, then those journey maps will be used. If that journey mapping is not something that we are doing, I believe those journey maps sit somewhere. They might be referenced here or there, but they're not generally used. Number 6, we have two to go. The myth of the power of the big consultancy. The myth of the power of the big consultancy. So what do I mean here? I have 2 dimensions. There's an implementation dimension or axis and a differentiation axis. What do I mean on the implementation axis? If your company is working on CX and they're looking at a competition, and I think when customers see us and the competition, the customer is going to make some kind of decision about whether we're good, whether we're not good. Are we good or we're not good? We have a bet. I'm going to hire someone who comes in, and I believe that we're going to do, what we're trying to do is not really different than what they say they're doing. We're all saying the same things in this competitive set. We're kind of saying the same things, but we will win because we actually do it better. We're more efficient. That's where we win, because they're talking about it, but their progress is like super baby steps. We can win because we're pretty efficient. We can make those steps. So while we're saying the same things, we're doing it, they're not. That's what I mean by the implementation. Big consultancies may have an advantage there because they have the manpower, they have the way of coming in and kind of, especially if you're a large organization, I'm talking in particular for large corporations, they have that advantage obviously over a boutique or a smaller consultancy. So that's what I mean by the implementation phase. We kind of look at this competition, kind of saying the same things, but we can actually do this thing that we're talking about. They're not, and that's that. The bottom axis is differentiation. And here it's sort of like, we want to be different. We're looking at the competition. We don't want to be like that. We want something different. We want this to be a wow, it could be a whatever else, but we want to be different. They want the experience to be scientific. We want our experience to be fun. That's different than everyone else. And in this instance, it's innovation. It's an innovative kind of thing that comes into play. And to push the organization into this new thing, whatever this new thing is, requires really this out of the box, whatever you want to call this, kind of thinking. And oftentimes in the CX world, boutique consultancies may have an advantage there because they're in competition with the big consultancies for some of those same large clients. Obviously, they don't have the manpower to compete for like running a program across 17 countries with all those things. So they don't compete in that space. but they have to also be different. So they have their little niche, their thing. But once they have their niche, if not all boutiques, by the way, but within that little niche area, this is our specialty. And they push the envelope because they understand that if they don't push the envelope, it's, others will copy or quickly catch up to them. So they're constantly pushing the envelope in that specialty area. So in the trick with boutiques, of course, is to understand what it is you're looking for. But with that boutiques, you can do a lot more on the differentiation side. Now, these are not absolute, obviously. Big consultancies can do great stuff on differentiation, and smaller consultancies can do quite a lot on implementation. The only limitation there is potentially their size. And sometimes that's not even a limitation, because with the way we hire consultants and cross-hire, they can expand just like anyone else can expand. And typically, when they do that, they might even have more experienced consultants who do the actual work. And that puts us with, that's the A and the B companies, kind of describing those companies and kind of like their strategic intent around CX. And of course, there can be a combination, which is kind of C. And you might say, well, we want both of those. We want to differentiate, we want it to be the best. Typically, there's trade-offs to these things. And again, if you take the first myth, if the company is honest with itself, like how different does it really want to be? Like not just in words, not just on paper. Can we just describe something different? But do we really want to be different? Few organizations I found have the guts right now to be different. You have to build up to it, get to that point of view, but it requires that amount of effort. Again, that slope you have to think about in terms of how much change needs to go to it. But these are the key concepts. But this is about consultancies, right? And I just kind of made, many people are thinking, and I don't want to necessarily name names, but I'm kind of saying there's, just as a rule of thumb, no absolutes. There's a reason to go to a big consultancy, and there's a reason to go to a boutique. It's not that the boutique is less expensive. I don't think that's the right reason to go to a boutique. And it's not that the big consultancy just has a name that everyone knows. That for me is not the right. They can be the reason, but that's if you're choosing that reason, I already know your company is not serious about CX. It just needs to have a name game thing that's going on. But there are real advantages to a big consultancy, and there are real advantages to the boutiques. Put that together, and I would say what the antidote to the myth of the power of the big consultancy is: choose the consultant, not the consultancy. Whether it's a big consultancy or a boutique, if you're doing some work and you're looking at consultants, of course boutiques have an advantage. If you just need a brand, then you're going to go with typically a boutique, and there are a few specialist boutiques that might kind of compete in certain areas. But just think of NPS, Satmetrics, Bain, and Fred Reichheld. Fred Reichheld, as a professor, was working on some things that are a little bit advanced. Culminated in a book, on loyalty, became in a sense the guru of loyalty, and then of course picked up with consultants. He probably was doing some work here and there, but now we think of Bain, or maybe we think of Satmetrics, the kind of the originators of NPS and the NPS system. But if you were pushing now you're not pushing the envelope if you use NPS, obviously. But back in the day, in the 90s, if you were one of those who had heard of something like loyalty and not just customer lifetime value, but the idea that NPS kind of gets you there, and you were a little bit ahead of the 2000, the millennium, and you were in the 90s and kind of were talking about that, you'd be talking to Fred Reichheld. You wouldn't be talking to Bain, and you probably wouldn't be talking to Satmetrics. That comes in 2000. That's my point. A lot of boutiques are that. When you're looking for cutting edge, and it's not just techniques, by the way, it's the ideas, even what reimagining what your business or your experience could be. Sometimes it's much better with a boutique than a big consultancy. So that's the myth of the power of the big consultancy. I'm really saying it's the consultant, and think about when and where you might have an advantage over a boutique or a big consultancy. And by the way, think about this. You may like the boutique. You have the rest of the organization who don't quite get CX. They're already sold on the big consultancy because they don't have to know anything else. Oh, you said this name? I'm with you. And by the way, if you're only there for the job, many times people also choose the big consultancy because it's safe, right? If it goes wrong, you blame the big consultancy. You know, the whole thing that we've heard many times. Okay, the power of the big consultancy. And we have a lesson here from the days of CRM, and I may have mentioned this, but if you think about this, this is kind of one way of telling that story. Technology, technology, technology. But I'm guessing some of you are old enough to remember the very early days of CRM, the earliest days of CRM. We're talking early 1990s or mid 1990s, when the Peppers and Rogers, the one-to-one future came out. And the idea was effectively, we have marketing, and now that's like this mass to one. Can we go one-to-one? We're a big corporation, but we kind of need to have a dialogue with our customer that's kind of close to this one-to-one dialogue. In order to have a dialogue, there's give and take, right? I heard what you said, and I respond appropriately. I heard what you said, and I respond appropriately. In order for that to happen, I have to have some memory of what you said. I have to have the memory of you as a person. CRM, the platforms took off because organizations said, how do we just know how much you bought when you came the last time. That's what we know. We don't know what your preferences are. We don't know what you like. We don't know what you dislike. And CRM kind of started with that. I'm making it very simple, but CRM started with that kind of concept. And if you think about it, the earliest, when I got into CRM game, the technology wasn't really there. CRM was an organizing principle in much the same way that CX is an organizing principle. In order to have a dialogue with the customer, you can't just have the front line just kind of like talking. The organization has to have this dialogue. There has to be some way to have this memory, a complex organization to have this dialogue. And then the technologies kind of came in, and that's where this took off in that sense. So technology took over, and now when we say CRM, I think no one thinks of organizing principle. We think of major players in CRM technology that a company would use. And by the way, consultancies love that technology takeover, because the finance department, who didn't know anything about dialogue with customers or procurement or whoever, they could create a form that kind of said, what are we going to buy? Oh, it's the system. Got it. How much does it cost? It's this much. Got it. When we pay it off? At this time. Got it. What does it do? Okay, something with the customer. Got that. But now I can put that in my spreadsheet. I understand what we're getting. I understand when you're going to implement it, and I understand when it works and that sort of thing. Not when it's effective, but I understand when the system works. So procurement and finance were happy with that. The actual use of CRM, that was a different thing. And there's a warning sign for that story for CX. And it's really here in the myth of the tech savior. The myth of the tech savior. All right. What this really is getting at is like the warning from CRM, where technology took over, and now we think when we say CRM, we mean technology. We're getting to the point where in CX, because one of the drawbacks of an unsuccessful program was soft metrics and, airy, light and soft, make customer happy, clappy sounding CX. No, we want to make it hard. And we're getting into technology and data, which allows us to have some of that hard operational and hard behavioral data. We can start parsing all kinds of things. And from the operational side, we already have that. And now from the behavioral side, because now things are going digital, we can analyze 10 million things about the customer behavioral data. And that allows us to pair this together. And now we can start thinking about the experience and kind of having this thing that's all happening. So AI and all the rest of it, some of these things here that we're using, some of it we will be using, are coming up. And including, that's not included here, more specific to us, journey analytics, and so forth. All that stuff is super important. And all journey analytics is doing is taking some data, putting it into something that looks like kind of like a journey, like journey map light, and then kind of parsing the behavioral and the operational data that says what's important at each of these points, and then we can now optimize whatever we're trying to do at those points, those touch points along the way, or moments of truth or whatever else to get to some outcome that we're talking about. So now that is super powerful. There's another box that we can buy, journey analytics or whatever else, AI. We can buy a box. Procurement can understand that box. IT can understand that box. Data analytics and data scientists can understand, here's the data that's coming in. We got some hard numbers on the back end. We can push and pull and prod. But if we forget our principles of CX, the fact that there's an emotional engagement, we don't understand exactly all the ins and outs of that, what constitutes an emotional engagement. We kind of know the outcomes. In a sense, what all this is, if you study psychology, is kind of like behaviorism, right? Behavioral psychology. Who cares what's happening in the black box in your head? We've got an outcome, your behavior, and we got some stuff that we can do. As long as we can see the behavioral change, that's all we care about. But there's cognitive psychology and other kinds of things that says actually, we actually better understand to impact this when we kind of understand and have a bit more knowledge about what's happening inside the head. And that is where loyalty comes from. This behavioral change gets us to something, and we can maybe approximate loyalty, but loyalty is something else that's different. Would a customer be willing to sacrifice to do business with us? That's a warning, and I guess my point here, I'm talking a little bit fast, but the warning here is technology is a huge opportunity for us. It's inevitable. We should be using it. We shouldn't be afraid of it. The real lesson is do not become the servant of the technology. Let technology be the servant of CX. That's the real lesson for the myth of the tech savior. And that's really that point of view. So let's got a quick recap, and then I'll open it up and see if you have any questions or comments, or see if you disagree with anything. This is, I call it the counterintuitive myths of customer experience, a little bit of battle scars, what I call covert lessons or battle scars of customer experience. There's the myth of CX Ascension that we always assume like this progression, but actually in business and also in our personal professional lives, there can also be this fall. And we need to be aware of that. And even when walking into situations, we need to be aware of that so we can better manage our frustration so we don't leave the field or become too irritated. The myth of CX declaration is basically the idea around this: don't accept the CX romance for commitment, the bobblehead concept. Just because people look like they're saying yes, they're talking to your face and doing all the things and giving off all the signs and symbols of yes, but actually they don't do anything. That also can cause this frustration, and that frustration can cause us to back away from fighting the good fight to move the organization forward. So the myth of CX declaration, don't get confused. The myth of the power of the top-down mandate was not all, but I'm being a little bit facetious. All you need is a CEO who says yes, but that yes, the CEO says can be one where he didn't really understand what was really required. Two, it can be bobblehead. Three, it can just be purely for show. And what we do need is to ratify that vision, but you, CX people, need to make sure that the business feels that it came bottom up. And number two, understand and let the business know that culture cannot be mandated. We want this cultural transformation. It's absolutely crucial for what we're doing with CX, but we can't mandate it. And as a result, your CX program has to include this cultural component, and not lip service. It's not just the course. It has to include it in order for it to be successful. Without that, I guarantee you, CX will become resented in the organization, and effectively, people, once resentment kicks in, they will then resist CX, and you basically, whatever slope you were, it goes, through the roof. The myth of the power of numbers, the fact that you need a case or an ROI, and you might have some numbers to show. Just be aware, of course, have numbers. I'm not against having numbers or the business case, or even if you come up with an ROI, I'm not against any of that. I think it's great. We should have it. We should do it more. We should practice it, rehearse it, get better at it. But crucial, once you have the numbers or as you're developing the numbers, is to tell the story of the numbers. As CX practitioners, I can't say this enough. It's that story that will inspire the organization, and that gets people closer to moving from compliance. The numbers helped us comply. You didn't do it, you did do it. You did do it, you didn't do it. To belief, where people latch onto it and they want to know why I didn't do something and let me work with it. And that's when they become hungry for more information, which the quantitative stuff then provides. The myth of the power of CX artifacts. We've already talked about this several times, but we can invest. The company's at the stage of compliance. We can invest in stuff. You know, some visionary, some person of authority with some budget, the power of the pen, signs off on the check. You get the system, you get the box, you get the journey analytics, you get the stuff, but the rest of the business doesn't use it because they don't believe in it. So they just try to figure out how to work around it, or minimum that's required not to be hit over the head for however your company uses those artifacts. Number 6, the myth of the power of the big consultancy. Great place for a big consultancy, but I'm actually suggesting that for certain things, you might want to consider boutique consultancies, because especially when you're trying to push the envelope or do something really, really cutting edge. In those instances, now you have to be in the network, and again, places like this are places to get a sense of who's doing what and where they are. Boutique consultancies should have a philosophy. They should be afraid of saying what their philosophy is in so many words, which allows you to then make a decision, make a call, yes or no. A big consultancy has a philosophy, but they, and again, as I said, choose the consultant. So just don't be concerned with the person who sold you the big partner who sold you the piece of work, and then you see them not ever, unless you're seeing the CEO, and then suddenly they're there, or they're there before you got there. So there is a role for the boutique, and but choose the consultant no matter what you are, and guarantee that that consultant, and again, it doesn't have to be the partner. I'm not saying seniority in the consultancy. I'm just saying when you select the consultancy, boutique or otherwise, make sure the consultants that you will work with, you know them ahead of time, and that's your team on that project. The myth of the tech savior is basically the idea that technology will come in and save the day, and we're kind of at that stage: digital, mobile, AI, whatever else you can throw in it, and I call it journey analytics and other kinds of things like that. Sentiment analysis that basically requires systems. These things are all important. They will advance us. They are inevitable. They're there, but don't become slaves to the technology. Make sure that you understand the experience that you want, and then use the technology. That's easier said than done, because sometimes we want those expertise that comes in, but effectively you can look around and see a lot of people who have become servants of the technology. And companies do this, by the way. They invest in stuff and then they tell you to come in and try to fix it, versus let's understand the experience and let's figure out what we need to make that happen. And of course, there's legacy in any large existing organization, but I think you get the point of where I am. If nothing, I think that's it for me. Thank you, everyone, and hopefully it was useful and you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.